The studio engineer bent down, smirked, and said it. "You're too small for this mic stand, kid." 9-year-old Michael didn't argue. He just looked at the man, took one breath, and did something nobody expected. The control room went quiet. 3 session musicians stopped tuning. The tape operator's hand froze mid-reach toward the console. Michael stood in the center of the isolation booth, his fingertips barely brushing the foam windscreen, and waited. No tantrum, no plea. Just that look, steady, patient, older than 9, and the room shifted. But here's the part you can't miss. 2 minutes earlier, the producer had already crossed Michael's name off the session sheet. It was a Tuesday afternoon in a mid-tier studio on the west side, the kind of place that smelled like solar and stale coffee, where the carpet stuck to your shoes and the mixing board had more tape patches than original faders. The Jackson 5 weren't supposed to be there. Their usual room was double-booked, and the label had called in a favor: 1 session, 1 take, no second chances. Michael's brothers were in the lounge. Jermaine was pacing. Tito kept checking his watch. Jackie sat with his arms folded, staring at the vending machine. Marlon hadn't said a word since they'd walked in. The vibe was tight. The producer, a man named Garrett, mid-40s, clipboard always in hand, had made it clear. They had 3 hours, and the clock was already running. Michael had been the last one through the door, smallest, quietest. The engineer, call him Ron, had glanced up from the patch bay, done the math, and decided the kid wasn't worth the setup time. "You're too small for this mic stand, kid." Ron hadn't whispered it. He'd said it like a fact, like gravity. And maybe that's what made it sting. Michael's shoulders didn't drop. His eyes didn't water. He just stood there, hands at his sides, and breathed. 1 second. 2. The kind of silence that makes people nervous. Then he spoke. "Can I try anyway?" His voice was calm, polite, no edge. Ron blinked. Garrett looked up from his clipboard. The session guitarist, an older guy with a goatee and a Telecaster, set his pick down. Nobody had expected the kid to ask. They'd expected him to leave. Ron exhaled through his nose. "Kid, the stand's fixed. I'd have to pull the whole rig to lower it. We don't have time." "I won't need it lower." The room tilted. Not physically, but every person in that space felt it. Garrett's pen stopped moving. The tape op turned in his chair. Tito stepped into the doorway from the lounge, half listening. Michael hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't argued. He'd just made a promise. And Ron, for reasons he'd question later, nodded. The session had started badly. The studio owner had double-booked the main tracking room, forcing the Jackson brothers into a smaller space with older gear. The console had a hum in Channel 3 that nobody could trace. The headphone mix kept drifting left. The air conditioning rattled every time the compressor kicked in. Garrett had spent 20 minutes on the phone with the label, explaining why they'd need to push the next session back. The clock on the wall showed 2:15. They'd be lucky to get 2 usable takes before the next booking arrived. Michael had watched all of it from the corner. Quiet. Observing. He'd seen Garrett cross his name off the sheet. Not out of malice, just practicality. If they were short on time, they'd cut the youngest member's solo pass and double-track Jermaine instead. It made sense. It was efficient. And it meant Michael would stand in the booth for 3 hours, singing backup, blending in. He didn't complain, he never did. But when Ron made the comment about the mic stand, something shifted in Michael's face. Not anger, not defiance, just clarity. 1 look, 1 breath, 1 decision. Ron flipped the talkback. "All right, kid, 1 pass. You blow it, we move on." Michael nodded. He stepped up to the mic. His nose was level with the bottom of the pop filter. His feet planted shoulder-width apart. His hands, small, steady, hovered near his ribs. The cue light blinked red. Garrett leaned into the glass. Playback in 5. The track rolled. Bass first, then drums. A simple groove. Motown adjacent, 4 on the floor, nothing fancy. The session guys had tracked it in 20 minutes. It was supposed to be filler. Background. The kind of song you'd forget by the time the album dropped. Michael closed his eyes and then he sang. The first note wasn't loud, it wasn't showy. It was just there, clear, centered, perfectly placed in the pocket between the kick and the snare. The second note bent upward, a microtonal shift that made the guitarist sit up straight. By the third phrase, Ron's hand had drifted away from the fader. He wasn't mixing anymore, he was listening. The melody was simple. 4 bars, repeated. But Michael wasn't just singing the notes, he was bending time, stretching syllables, finding spaces in the groove that shouldn't have existed. His phrasing was conversational, like he was telling you a secret, leaning in close, trusting you to keep it. Garrett's pen slipped from his hand. It clattered on the console. Nobody picked it up. The tape-op's jaw had gone slack. The session bassist, a guy who'd played on 200 records and acted like he'd seen everything, was staring at the booth like he'd just witnessed a magic trick he couldn't explain. Tito stood frozen in the doorway. Jermaine appeared behind him. Then Jackie, then Marlon. All 4 brothers, silent, watching their youngest sibling do something they'd seen 1,000 times, but somehow never quite like this. Michael's eyes were still closed. His body swayed, barely, just a pulse, matching the hi-hat. His right hand lifted, fingers loose, conducting an invisible orchestra. He wasn't performing, he was inside the song. And the song was inside him. Wait, notice this. The room wasn't just quiet. It was holding its breath. Ron had worked in studios for 15 years. He'd engineered sessions for gospel quartets, jazz trios, rock bands with more attitude than talent. He'd heard good singers. He'd heard great singers. He'd even heard a few singers who could make you forget where you were for a minute or two. But this was different. This wasn't technique. This wasn't training. This was instinct so refined it looked like magic. Michael's voice moved through the track like water finding cracks in stone. Effortless, inevitable, impossible to redirect. He wasn't following the melody. He was rewriting it in real time, finding phrasing choices that made the simple chord progression sound like it had been composed specifically for his voice. The session guitarist glanced at the bassist. The bassist glanced back. Neither of them said a word, but the look was clear. We just heard something we're going to remember for the rest of our lives. Ron's hand moved, not toward the fader, toward the talkback button. His finger hovered. For a split second, it looked like he was going to stop the take, cut it short. But he didn't press it. He pulled his hand back, slow, unsure. The bridge hit. Michael opened his eyes. He looked straight through the glass, not at Ron, not at Garrett, at nothing and everything. His voice climbed, not in volume, in weight. Every word carried intention. Every breath had purpose. The session guitarist reached for his tuner, checked it, set it down. The pitch was perfect. Impossibly perfect. But it wasn't the pitch that mattered, it was the feeling. Garrett leaned back in his chair, his arms folded, his face unreadable. The tape-op glanced at him, then back at the booth. The brothers didn't move, didn't blink. The groove kept rolling. Michael kept singing. And somewhere in that cramped, coffee-stained studio the hierarchy dissolved. The kid, who was too small, had just rewritten the session. The final note hung in the air, sustained, controlled, then released. The track faded. The cue light blinked off. Michael opened his eyes, looked at Ron, and waited. Nobody spoke. Garrett stood, slow, deliberate. He stepped to the glass, one hand pressed flat against it, and stared at the boy on the other side. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Run it back. Ron's head snapped toward him. What? Run. It. Back. The tape op rewound. The brothers stepped into the control room. The session musicians leaned in, and when the playback started, the room heard what Michael had just done. No effects, no reverb, just the raw vocal, dry and exposed, sitting perfectly in the mix like it had always belonged there. The bassist whistled low. The guitarist shook his head. Jermaine's hand found Michael's shoulder through the glass, even though his brother couldn't feel it. Ron stood, walked to the booth door, opened it. Michael stepped out, still calm, still quiet. Ron looked down at him. This kid who barely reached his chest, and for the first time that day his smirk was gone. "Where'd you learn that?" Michael shrugged. "I just listened." Ron didn't know what to say to that. He'd spent years studying microphone technique, compression ratios, EQ curves. He'd read books, taken courses, worked under engineers who'd tracked Sinatra and Ella. And this 9-year-old kid who couldn't reach the pop filter without standing on his toes had just given him a lesson in something no manual could teach. Listening, not hearing. Listening. Here's what you need to understand. Michael didn't grandstand. He didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He just walked back into the lounge, sat down next to Marlon, and drank a paper cup of water. But the room had changed. Garrett called the label from the desk phone. Ron adjusted every mic in the booth, even the ones that didn't need it. The session guys stayed for the next 2 hours, unpaid, because they wanted to see what else the kid could do. They ran 4 more takes, each one different, each one perfect in its own way. Michael never asked for direction. He'd listen to the playback, nod, and offer a variation. "What if I came in a beat earlier here? Could we try it softer on the second verse?" Every suggestion landed. Every choice elevated the song. By the time the brothers left that night, the song that was supposed to be filler had become the lead single. The engineer who'd called Michael too small had already told 3 people about the take, and the producer who'd crossed the kid's name off the sheet had rewritten the entire session schedule around him. Michael walked out the same way he'd walked in, quiet, small, unassuming. But everyone in that building knew size had nothing to do with it. The studio door closed, the streetlights buzzed. Tito ruffled Michael's hair. "You showed him." Michael looked up. "I just wanted to sing." And maybe that's the point. He didn't set out to prove anyone wrong. He didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't demand respect. He just did the work. And the work spoke louder than any comeback ever could. Ron still tells the story. 30 years later, in a different studio, with different gear, he'll stop mid-session and say, "I once told Michael Jackson he was too small." And then he'll pause. "I was the one who didn't measure up." Garrett kept the original tape, never erased it, never dubbed over it. He plays it sometimes late at night when the room is empty and the console is off. And every time, he hears the same thing. A 9-year-old boy who understood something most adults spend a lifetime trying to learn. Respect isn't given, it's earned. Not with words, not with size, not with volume, with presence, with patience, with the quiet certainty that when the cue light blinks red, you're ready. Michael was ready. He'd always been ready. The room just needed to catch up.